Me here to speak to you, and my old friend Mr. Chhajjar. As I said, he's now given an introduction that I now have to live up to. So he's raised this bar. Let me see if I can live up to it. Okay, so we are meeting these days at a time when there are a lot of expectations about the rise of India after literally hundreds of years of our decline. Some of it because of external occupation of the country, some of it because of self-imposed restrictions in our own heads about what we could achieve. So first let me do one thing, give you a flavor of what I think is happening right now, what our framework of thinking about reforms and economic policy are, and then I will talk a little bit about a wider issue which I have been bringing up recently and for some years about the underlying framework, the cultural framework necessary for a long range revival of India, not just as an economy but as a civilization. So first of all, where are we today? So the fact is that India, as we speak, is easily by some margin the fastest growing economy in the world. Last year we grew at over 8%, this year we'll be slowing down a little bit to around about 7%, but still, literally there's nobody in our range of growth. And Japan, most of Europe is growing at barely 0.2, 0.3 kinds of growth rates. The US has a higher growth rate, but let me say that given the large revisions that they have now had, they'll probably have to now revise down their growth rates very significantly for the last year. And it's, many of you who export to these Western countries know that these economies are not growing. Even China, which for a large economy size is still growing very fast, is still growing at something in the range of 4.5% and thereabouts. So we are really standing out in terms of how fast we are growing. But to appreciate what we are doing right now, you need to go back a little bit. Let's go back to 1991. Very often people forget that in the early 90s, that's about half a century after we became free. You know how big our economy was when we began to liberalize our economy? It was only $260 billion nominal. 260 billion, okay? It then took us 16 years to cross the $1 billion mark. Okay, so we went from 1991-92 at 260 billion. It was only in 2007, just as the global financial crisis was taking off, we finally reached the mark of $1 trillion economy. Then it took us 5 more years to 14-15 to become a true $1 trillion economy. So it took us 5 years then to add $1 more trillion to the economy. It should have then taken us less than 5 years to become a $3 trillion economy. But then we got hit by COVID and so on, as you know, so we lost a couple of years. So it took us 7 years. And it's only in about 21-22 that we finally crossed the $3 trillion mark. And since then it has taken us just 3 years to hit a $4 trillion mark. This year we will hit around about $4 trillion. Why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because people tend to forget the power of compounding. You all learn it in high school, but it's very important you understand the power of compounding. So we have this year we will hit $4 trillion economy, and then it will take us a little less than about 2.5 years or thereabouts to hit another $1 trillion, maybe 2 years more to hit the next $1 trillion and so on. So when we do the next $1 trillion and hit in around 2027, become a $5 trillion economy, we will have gone past Japan and Germany to become the world's 3rd largest economy. In fact, in purchasing power terms, we already are the 3rd largest economy in the world. So the first and most important thing I want to impress upon you is that this game is about compounding. And compound interest rates are one of the most powerful tools there are. So sustaining this compounding process is the game. So when you look back at China and India in 1990-91, when our economy and their economy was about roughly the same size, and they have now become significantly larger than us. So we are hitting, right now we are hitting a $4 trillion mark, they are at 19 trillion. That gap is because they grew at about 2.5 percentage points faster than us. That was the real performance difference. We actually grew reasonably fast. Other than China, no major economy has grown at the pace we have grown at. But this difference in growth performance is what got us there. So if we can do a similar difference of 2.5 percentage points faster than them for the next 25 years or so, then we will catch up with them. It is just an arithmetic fact. It's not an opinion. It's an arithmetic fact. And we already are growing at 7% and they growing at 4.5%. We already have that growth differential. So the real game is about how we can sustain this over long periods of time. Now this is not as easy as you may think. 7% growth, when we say, many people say, oh, but we should grow at double-digit growth and so on. I'm afraid, as I will show you, these are dangerous things to say, because this is about compounding. Growing by a little bit faster in any one year has no benefit at all. It gets you a percentage point here and there. The game is about compounding. So the first point that I want to make is that this is about compounding 7%, even 7% GDP growth rate over the next 25 years will let us catch up with China. And doing this 7% under the economic conditions we have around us, when we are unable pretty much to export our way into growth, where almost the rest of the world, large parts of it are a recession or going into recession, under those circumstances, it's no small task. And of course, when we are talking of 25 years, there will be periods when the world will be in a better growth phase. Yes, in those circumstances, we will be able to generate very high growth rates. But today, doing somewhere in this growth range is good enough. Because as I told you, this is about compounding this growth over long periods of time. So what do we need in order to keep this going? Because growth is not, it doesn't happen suddenly, naturally. It is something we have to earn. You know, sometimes you have economists, some well-known economists who will make statements like, oh, India is growing faster because it is a very poor economy. So it's just catching up. Well, we were even poorer in the 1960s and 70s. We weren't growing faster. So we have to earn this growth. So what do we need to do? The most important thing we need to do is not to get carried away by various kinds of demand management. Okay, during cycles you need to lean against the wind, that's a different matter. But on a sustained basis, growth requires supply side investment. This means we need to get our infrastructure up and running, we need to invest into good policies, and so on and so forth. So let me get a little bit into the depth of this issue. If you had talked to somebody about 10 years ago, what were the big, or even go back a little bit even to the 90s, what were the big issues? The big issues in the early 90s was that the Indian state simply didn't allow private effort and enterprise to do the things. So most of the 90s and early 2000s, when you said reform, you actually meant liberalization. In fact, the two words were used as interchangeably. So we spent most of the 90s and 2000s essentially liberalizing the economy, essentially stopping the Indian state from doing the things it should not do and opening up the space for the things where the private sector can come in. That while, it's still work in progress, there are still areas we need to do more, but by and large, by the mid to 2010s, that work to a large extent had been done. What now needed to be done was to create the frameworks in which this new liberalized economy could function. So some part of that started even in the 90s. We began to create the regulators. So SEBI, for example, really came on its own in the 90s. RBI was given new tasks. Other regulators came. But the other frameworks we need, one was creating the physical infrastructure framework for high growth. And this is something we have done over the last 10 years. And you can see that there has been a dramatic improvement. Even our detractors of this government will agree that the network of highways, the airports, the ports have dramatically improved over the last decade. We are now investing in the next level of this. You may have read in the newspapers that we are now creating a big port in Madhavan, just north of Mumbai. Now this is going to be by some margin the largest port of India, and this is finally we are beginning to do things in sort of Chinese scales, if you may say. This is going to be a massive port. So we are beginning to do those kinds of big scale reform infrastructure that will allow for world level economy to function. That is what we are building, and the government will continue to do this, and of course wherever necessary the private sector will be also participating in this. The second big thing that we needed to do was to create the policy frameworks for, so one is the physical infrastructure framework, now the policy frameworks. One major policy framework was, and this is something relates to my next point that I will come to, is the anchor for macroeconomic policy, which was inflation targeting. I mean, this may look like a geeky thing, many people don't bother about outside of the world of economics, but creating a explicit inflation targeting framework is a very big deal, because we have actually become a reasonably well controlled inflation country. Inflation today hangs around in the 4% range. We have a range of 6 to 2. We have barely ever gone outside of this range of 6 to 2. This is not bad for a country that historically was a reasonably high inflation country. We were never an Argentina type high inflation country, but we were a country where inflation used to be in the 8 to 12% range. We have now become a 2 to 6% range inflation country. Anchoring it here has many long-term benefits, not the least that it will eventually allow us finally bring down the cost of capital into developed country range. It takes time, but you first have to create this credibility, and it's painful to do. That's why nobody does it, because you effectively have to hold the system together and keep it tight. And again, as I said, it's a point I will come to a little bit later. The second major framework we created was GST. Many people complain about the problems of GST, and I'm not saying that it cannot be improved, but do remember where we came from. Every state having its own indirect tax system, even sometimes cities having their own indirect tax system, and the utter confusion and chaos it created to a system that is unified is a very big deal. GST effectively is a free trade agreement that India signed with itself. And for all the problems that may arise out of it, and I'm not claiming that's a perfect system, it is a dramatic improvement on whatever existed before. And let me tell you that even 50 years from now, when hopefully my children and grandchildren will be running the system, they will be running some GST type system. Hopefully they will have gotten rid of the wrinkles, improved it and so on. But the framework is almost certainly going to be the very one that we have introduced. So it's a very big deal to have created that framework of GST. Third big thing that we created was a framework for insolvency and bankruptcy. This is the framework for creating a modern entrepreneurship driven economy Without this, creative destruction cannot happen. Unless you have a robust form of insolvency and bankruptcy, you cannot have a banking system that is robust, and I will again come back to this point in the next point I'm going to make. But very importantly, it doesn't, if you don't have ease of exit, there is no ease of entry actually. And so we created this framework for insolvency and bankruptcy. I'm giving you all these frameworks so that you understand that we are systematically creating these frameworks. So what are the future frameworks that we need to think about? Here are a few. One, just like we have invested in intercity infrastructure over the last decade, and we will do more of that, we now need to begin investing in intra-city infrastructure. We need to build new cities. We need to mend our old cities. Many of our cities are essentially become unlivable. You know, when I was younger, I used to believe that we are poor and therefore our cities are dysfunctional. When we become richer, our cities will be better. Now we are richer and they are not better. So clearly we need to invest in our cities. Municipal infrastructure is something we need to put our minds to. Second, we need to reform our bureaucracy. Administrative reforms is of absolute necessity. Third, we need to reform our judicial system. It is ridiculous that even commonplace cases take decades to be able to make their way through the legal process. Enforcement of contracts is one of the most important things that a state is supposed to deliver. Even if you go back and read Kautilya and the Arthashastra, he will tell you that the delivery of justice and the enforcement of contracts is one of the most important things that the state provides. We are unable to do this. So there has to be a national debate and discussion about legal process reforms. So this is just my first point of the framework of things we need to do. The second point, which links to my first point, is that we need to do all of this while ensuring macroeconomic stability. Why is this important? Because you see, if you go back and look at economic history, you will see something very important. There are many countries who have had flashes of growth. So you go back to the 40s and 50s, when you talked about their equivalent of what were considered the rapidly growing emerging markets or whatever the term they used at that time was, they would have talked about Latin America. The great hopes of the 1930s, 40s, 50s were, guess what? Brazil and Argentina. They were considered to be growing so fast that they would one day become developed countries. And of course, they fell off the cycle and never quite got back on the rails again. Then in the 90s, you will remember, there used to be Thailand, Indonesia, all these Southeast Asian countries. Then in 1997-98, there was an Asian crisis. They fell off the rail and they never quite got back on the rails again. It's not like they are still in crisis. They did get back and begin to grow again, but they never got those kinds of high growth again. So the point I'm making is, getting a few years of high growth is easy. Keeping it going for a full generation is totally not easy. And this requires us, therefore, to be willing, and this goes back to the point I made earlier, about being able to maintain macroeconomic stability. Now this means that the governments of the day, may not be this government, I'm talking about a 25-year period, future governments, future economists who will run this thing, this system, maybe she will be one of them. Remember, macroeconomic stability is never going to be popular because it requires you to restrain spending, it requires you to lean against the wind, it may require you to, for example, increase the capital gains tax when you think the markets are frothy, and so on and so forth. But this is absolutely critically important to do, because if you don't do it, then let me show you what happens, because effectively you will have a period of high growth, your banking system will lend heavily out, and at some point it will mislend, and your banking system will, and your financial system, not just banking system, the wider financial system including stock markets, etc., will misallocate so much resources that it will eventually stall. And then cleaning it up is an extremely painful thing. As somebody involved in the last round of cleaning up of the banks, let me tell you how painful it gets. You will remember that we had a period of high growth in the 2000s, in the first Manmohan Singh regime. Now some of that happened, a lot of that happened because the global environment was benign, and because there had been some good reforms done under the Vajpayee regime, so you got the benefit of that. Unfortunately, that momentum of reform was not sustained, and then of course you got the global environment deteriorated because of the global shock. So how was growth revived in the subsequent 5 years from 2007 to 2013? It was kept going by essentially pumping up the financial sector and not bothering about macro stability. So it got us growth for a few years, but it led to huge amount of lending to all kinds of projects that were never going to be, even then, were never going to be successful. And so by 2013, we began to be known as the Fragile Five. You will remember all of this. Then it required a lot of painful things to do in order to clean the banks up. So let me tell you about that process. So when I joined the government in 2017, the then finance minister, Jaitley ji, called me into the room very earlier in the cycle of my being in the finance ministry and told me, Sanjeev, you are one of the few people in this building who's actually done banking. So what can you do about the banking system? Because all the numbers we are getting suggests that the banking system is essentially bust. Now the thinking at that time was that you take all this massive amount of bad loans, NPAs, and you put all of them into something called a bad bank. Then you use taxpayer money to recapitalize the banks, so at least the banks can go back into the business of lending. That was the way most people said this can be resolved, and they gave various examples, US, this, that, etc. Now I went and looked into the matter and came to a very different conclusion. I said that, look, we have done this in the past. There used to be something called the BIFR, which is where dead companies went to be on life support. Large amounts, not only did you recapitalize the banks, but it never solved anything because you kept pumping more and more money to keep these half-dead zombie companies alive in this BIFR. And of course, you kept incompetent managements alive in those things who were also in many cases continued to siphon money out. So this would not resolve the money, it would convert the problem into a perpetual problem where the banking system would remain jammed up and fiscal deficits would keep rising because these are running into lakhs of crores which we would have to keep pumping money into. So I said, look, we have got to find a different way of doing it. So I came up with the view that why don't we use a newly minted law in 2016, we had just before I joined, a new law had been introduced called the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. And I said, why don't we use it to actually bankrupt these companies and sell them off? Because my view is, bankrupting a company may be bad for the promoter, but why is it bad for the economy? It just goes, for the economy, it doesn't matter whether Mr. X owns it or Mr. Y owns it. You just bankrupted it, gave it to the other guy, the banks get back some part of the thing and the system can get going. So I went and convinced the then banking secretary, a lady called Anjali Duggal, and I then also talked to the IBBI chairman, Dr. Sahu. They agreed with me. And then I also talked to the RBI and several of the deputy governors there, and they also agreed with me. But there was one problem, that the insolvency and bankruptcy system had never been tested. So the first thing is, okay, good idea, good in theory, but if I have this completely untested system and I take all these guys through it, how do we know it will work? How do you know the insolvency and bankruptcy system will work? Why don't we take and do a test case and take some small companies through? So again went back to the drawing board and did some research. And what I discovered is quite interesting, that just 50 companies accounted for 70% of the NPAs. And in fact 12 companies accounted for 30% of the NPAs. I named those 12 companies the dirty dozen. You will remember this term from that time. And I went back and said, look, maybe the NCLTs were just been formed, they can't deal with hundreds of cases, but at least 12 cases they can deal with. And by the way, the complicatedness of a case is uncorrelated to the size of the case, right? And most of these cases were simple steel companies or some very simple cases. So I said, why do the test cases with small case? Let's take large cases, and I showed that all the cases that we were dealing in the top 12 were actually simple cases. So we took 12 cases through the NCLT, and as you will remember, many of them got sold off. They were sold off at good prices. The banks got some money back, so they got recapitalized. Okay, we had given them some money, but actually much of the recapitalization happened from the recoveries. These assets got taken up by other managers who actually turned them around and began to pay taxes. And most of the other companies of that 50 actually didn't have to be taken to NCLT. Their promoters miraculously found the money and paid us back. So in this way, we managed to clean up the banks. Why am I telling you this? Is because while doing it, it was quite painful. Because bankrupting companies and large companies is risky politically, because there is risk of loss of jobs and so on. But you have to be willing to do it. And even in the medium term, and maybe even in the short term, it actually turns out to be not just cheaper, but even good for the economy, even in the short term. So for example, in the height of COVID, India's largest private sector airline, Jet Airways, went bust. And again the same arguments were made, that oh my God, our civil aviation sector will suddenly stall. Nothing happened. It went bankrupt, other companies grew and took up that space, and we kept going. So I think first and foremost, we have to have greater faith in the creative destruction process. Never confuse the personal interests of capitalists with capitalism. We have to be willing to allow that process to take place, and sometimes it's painful for individuals, but we cannot allow the system itself to be hijacked. The same thing is true when you have to hold the faith by leaning against the wind during periods when it is very tempting to inflate the system. Because if your economy is growing well, everybody wants you to grow even faster. That is the time you have to be willing to lean against the wind, because that is what creates the space for you to be able to lean the other way. Only when you have some savings can you run it down. So you have to be willing to hold your guns for long periods of time, because only then can you keep this going from some 25 odd years. So this is my second point. First point, high rates of growth but without losing our cool. Second, macroeconomic stability. The third point is, you have to be willing to take some part of the growth generated and pass it on to the bottom of our society, because there is, even with growth and when there's benefits to majority perhaps of the population, there will be part of the population that requires direct support. Now this point is a very different point than the Western debate on inequality. This is about absolute poverty and trying to help the absolutely people at the bottom. The term in India that we use for it is Antyodaya, i.e. the rise of the bottom. Yeah, this is targeting of absolute poverty, whether you do it through Prime Minister's Awas Yojana or the health insurance jam trinity and direct benefit transfer, with those we can debate. That's perfectly fine. You can debate it whether they're efficient, good or not. But you do need to provide them support. Now this is a very different debate from the one that very often Western scholars try to trip us into, which is a debate about their vision of inequality, their idea of trying to guilt trip us about Indian billionaires. We are 1/6 of the world's population. We have a right to 1/6 of the world's billionaires. All these NGOs, Oxfam, all these scholars, Piketty and all these people, they will all crib about Indian billionaires. But please go and look at who funds them. Okay, Ford Foundations, Rockefeller Foundation, Soros's Open Society, Omidyar Foundation, Gates Foundation. अरे भाई, फोर्ड, रॉकफेलर, गेट्स, ये लोग कौन है? बिलियनर्स हैं. It's a problem when they are brown skinned billionaires, but no problem when they are white skinned billionaires. So we should not be in any way guilt tripped about our wealthy. Our problem is not the number of billionaires we have. In fact, we need more of them. Because in the end, it is our billionaires, and particularly first generation billionaires, who generate the jobs, the innovation, the growth and the taxes. Piketty and Oxfam are not going to be able to create those jobs or the taxes. In fact, nobody knows of a single job that Piketty has created other than that of himself and his small team. So please let us not get tripped into this. We have to focus on absolute poverty, and yes, some part of our resources has to go to them directly, and we have to do it our way. Now that I have given you this general framework of discussion, let me now take this to a wider issue that is important, and it is important here particularly in Kolkata because it's the city of my birth, and in some ways it's perhaps the biggest test case of the point I'm going to make. In the end, every society becomes the heroes that it worships. Economics, politics, business, all of these are ultimately downstream of culture. If you have a culture of risk taking, if you have a culture of pursuit of excellence, then that is what your economics and politics will be about. Now it's very often very difficult to say these things about your own culture, so it's sometimes easier to give this example from some other culture so that you know it by analogy. So let's go to Europe. Okay, we are today witnessing Europe's decline, but let's be clear, for the last 500 years they dominated the world. They and offshoots of Europe dominated the world. So I'm taking North America in the same breath. So how did that happen? So in order to understand this, you need to go back to the 15th and 16th century. So in the 15th and 16th century, Europe had actually been in decline for a full 1,000 years. Okay? After the decline of the Roman Empire, Europe had become a backwater. India, China, the Arabs, they had been the real center of the world economy. Europe had been at a side game. And then something very unique happened in Europe in a period we now know as the Renaissance. Very often people think of the Renaissance when they go to Florence and Venice and they look at the beautiful buildings and they see the art and culture. But in fact, it was not about just art and culture. Florence, you have to remember, was a banking center. Their great invention was the double entry bookkeeping system. Venice's great contribution to world civilization is not art. It is the stock market. Okay? And suddenly what you are happening is that there is a huge amount of risk taking that is going on. Intellectual risk taking in multiple fields. So just when Vasco da Gama is sailing around the world to come to India, Columbus is sailing to the Americas, or is coming to India. It's not about their navigation skills. Well, Columbus was wrong about where he was going. It was really about his risk taking, his willingness to simply get into a tiny wooden ship and sail into the unknown. It was the willingness of Galileo, the scientist, to question the thinking of the times. So this is all about risk taking. And interestingly, many of these people knew each other. So Francis Drake sailed around the world. He was actually a pirate, by the way. Yes, he was a officially sanctioned pirate, but he was a pirate. But he was also somebody who was very likely watched Shakespeare perform his plays for the very first time. So that was the same society that created Shakespeare. So the point I'm making is that a society that is open to risk taking, to the pursuit of excellence, will begin to do it in multiple fields simultaneously and succeed. This is what clearly the catering department disagrees with me. Now, this is what Bengal did for about 100 years. From the middle of the 19th century till the middle of the 20th century, we had a situation in Bengal that in response to colonial occupation, there was a remarkable period which we also know as the Bengal Renaissance. All of a sudden, Bengal generated people of the caliber of Swami Vivekanand, Sri Aurobindo, Netaji Subhash Bose, Robi Thakur. There were scientists of the caliber of A.J.C. Bose. There were businessmen like Mohini Mohan Chakrabarti, and so on and so forth. Interestingly, they all knew each other. People forget this, but most of these people actually knew each other. So there were a tiny number of people suddenly doing unbelievable risk taking in multiple fields. And it led to not just Bengal but all of India suddenly being reignited in multiple fields. Not just the freedom struggle, but a renaissance in culture, a renaissance in business and all kinds of things. I talked about Mohini Mohan Chakrabarti, particularly much forgotten today. Incidentally, my great-grandfather, who in the 1940s ran one of Asia's largest textile mills called Mohini Mills, which is on the other side of the border. And guess who was in his board of directors? Rabindranath Tagore. So these were all people who knew each other and were doing various kinds of things. But then, at some point in time, around about 1970, this whole thing come unstuck. I was born in that year, so maybe it has something to do with that. But when I was born in 1970, Kolkata was still the single largest industrial hub in this country. And from then to now, we have come to a stage where Kolkata does not even count among the big industrial hubs, in today's 2024 India. It has been in continuous decline. There are many reasons for this. I don't need to get many of you witnesses to the murder of Kolkata, as I was. But this happened first with this ideological bent of the communist, where basically they demonized risk-taking in the business space. Now, having demonized a particular kind of risk-taking and pursuit of excellence, did they get better risk-taking in other fields? No. Bengal never created another Robi Thakur. It never produced another Netaji Subhash Bose. It never produced anybody of that kind of caliber ever again. So the closing of mind does not happen in one space. It happens in multiple spaces at the same time. And once it happens, it is a very, very slippery slope. So the point I'm making, not just for Bengal, for the India as a whole, is that we need to, as a people, Indians as a whole, begin to think about a culture change. This culture change requires us to so, very often people want, the political leadership, the government or somebody to cause this culture change. But in fact, culture change does not happen from the top. It happens only from the bottom. In the end, governments, businesses, everybody will ultimately do what the general culture is. And if the general culture is freebies, then you will get freebies. If the general culture of a people is that the pinnacle of achievement is to become a gunda politician, then that society will generate gunda politicians. If the pinnacle of that society is is to become a bureaucrat, then you will get bureaucrats. And sometimes those bureaucrats, if you're unlucky, will end up working for those gunda politicians. So, if we want to be a society that believes in risk-taking, it believes in the pursuit of excellence, then we as a society have to begin to demand it. There is no other shortcut out of this. What the Europeans went through in the 15th century and the 16th century is something that we have to begin to inculcate, because then everything else will rise from that. Because this does not happen in silos. You will not get a cultural renaissance without an economic renaissance. You will not even win gold medals in the Olympics without improvements in other fields. So, since this is a big business chamber, I very often give these lectures, I berate the government, bureaucracy and other things for the changes they need to make. But this same cultural problem also exists in the business community. India is quite unique if you go and look in the how little R&D the business community does. You'll be shocked. We are among the lowest in the world. The amount of research and development that Indian businessmen do, and I'm not talking about small, medium businesses. I'm talking about large businesses. We are now the $4 trillion economy I talked about. We will shortly be the world's third largest economy. Our companies are no longer small companies. Our pharmaceutical companies are no longer, they're world-class companies. Our software companies are world-size companies. And if you go and look at the amount of research and development we do, it is abysmal. That's because we are not pushing the boundaries. And this is not because our scientists are not capable. Indian scientists are doing all the research abroad. Interestingly, they are doing it even in India. But they don't do it for Indian companies. They do it for multinational company GCCs. So even in India, Indians are doing research, but not for our own companies, because our business does not want to push the boundaries. So we need to push the boundaries in every facet of human striving. This must include aspiration of our business community. The poverty of aspiration, unfortunately, infects all of us. This infects our sportsmen and our sports bodies, which are more dens of politics than sports. This infects our cultural institutions, which are more interested in ideology than producing things of artistic importance. And it is also true of our business community, which is more interested in protectionism than it is interested in cutting-edge technologies. Now, in each one of these things, some protection, some support may be needed. But this cannot be the end-all of all conversation. So we as a society need to now think about this seriously, because as I pointed out to you, we now stand at the cusp of greatness. But to be a great country, we need to take that risk. Every facet of our society needs to do this. Our artists need to do it, our sportsmen need to do it, our bureaucrats need to do it, our politicians need to do it, and yes, our academics also need to do it. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.